Hello, you tired little peeps. It's that time once again. So let's snuggle up fast because tonight we're traveling back in time to wander the dimly lit streets of the Eternal City, exploring the forbidden games of chance and the nocturnal habits that thrived in the shadows of ancient Rome. So if you are new to the channel or returning, liking the video significantly helps. Also, please let me know where you're listening in from and what time it is for you. Now get comfortable and let's begin. When the sun dipped below the horizon in ancient Rome, the character of the city underwent a profound transformation. During the daylight hours, Rome was the center of administrative power, commerce, and public order. It was a city of marble forums, bustling markets, and noisy processions. But as twilight settled over the seven hills, a different version of the city emerged. It was a version that operated under different rules, driven by the pursuit of leisure and the thrill of risk. We often imagine the Romans solely as disciplined soldiers or stoic senators, but the night revealed their desire for release from the strict social hierarchies that governed their days. Tonight, we look closely at this nocturnal world, specifically focusing on the activities that the state tried to suppress but the people refused to abandon. The world of gambling and the tavern culture. To understand why gambling and nightlife were considered forbidden pleasures, we must first look at the legal framework of the time. In the eyes of the Roman law, particularly during the Republican era and extending into the Empire, gambling with money was strictly prohibited for the general populace. This prohibition was not merely a suggestion. It was codified in laws known as the leges aleatoriae. The Latin word for a gambler was aleator, derived from alea, referring to a game of dice or chance. The state viewed gambling as a destabilizing force. It was believed that a citizen who wasted his patrimony on the roll of a die was a citizen who could not contribute to the stability of the state. Therefore, except for the festival of Saturnalia in December, when social norms were inverted and gambling was publicly permitted, betting money on games of chance was illegal. However, the existence of a law does not equate to the absence of the activity. In fact, the severity of the prohibition suggests just how pervasive the habit was. The Romans were avid gamblers. From the highest emperor to the lowest slave, the fascination with prediction and chance was universal. The law tried to curb this by refusing to recognize gambling debts. If a person lost a fortune in a dice game, they were not legally obligated to pay, and the winner had no legal recourse to collect. Furthermore, if a person allowed gambling in their house, they could not claim damages for any theft or assault that occurred during the game. The law essentially removed the protection of the state from these activities, pushing them into the shadows, into the back rooms of taverns and private clubs where the city guard, the vigils, might not look too closely. The primary setting for these nocturnal activities was the popina, or the taberna. These were the wine bars and taverns of antiquity. While a taberna could refer to any shop, in the context of nightlife, it usually meant a place where wine was sold and consumed on the premises. The popina was a specific type of establishment, often associated with lower-class dining and drinking, where hot food was served alongside wine. These establishments were ubiquitous in Rome. Archaeological evidence from cities like Pompeii and Ostia reveals that nearly every city block had a place to drink. They were the living rooms of the poor. Since most insulae, the apartment blocks where the majority of Romans lived, lacked kitchens or comfortable spaces for socializing, the popina became the essential social hub. Entering a popina at night, one would be met with a very specific atmosphere. These were not grand halls. They were often small, cramped spaces on the ground floor of a building, opening directly onto the street. The counters were typically L-shaped, masonry structures into which large terracotta jars, known as dolia, were set. These jars held the wine and foodstuffs, keeping them cool in the summer and accessible to the server. The walls were frequently decorated with simple frescoes depicting scenes of daily life, men drinking, playing dice, or arguing over a game. The light would have been dim, provided by flickering oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the plastered walls. The air would be thick with the smell of cheap wine, garlic, fish sauce, and the smoke from the lamps. It was here, in these dimly lit establishments, that the game boards were laid out. The most common form of gambling involved dice. The Romans used two main types of dice. The first was the tesserae, which were essentially identical to the six-sided dice we use today. They were cubes made from bone, ivory, wood, or sometimes even crystal or bronze. The numbers were marked with small, concentric circles, usually arranged so that opposite sides added up to 7, 1 opposite 6, 2 opposite 5, and 3 opposite 4. The second type was the tali, or knuckle bones. These were originally made from the astragalus bone of a sheep or goat, though they were later manufactured from other materials to mimic the shape. Unlike the cubic tesserae, the tali had 4 long faces and 2 short rounded ends on which they could not land. The 4 faces were numbered 1, 3, 4, and 6. The mechanics of these games were designed to be simple yet engaging. In a standard game with tesserae, players would typically use 3 dice. To prevent cheating, a constant concern in a society where sleight of hand was common, the Romans used a device called a fritillus. This was a dice cup, or a tower. The fritillus was often made of leather or pottery. The interior might be grooved to ensure the dice tumbled thoroughly before hitting the table. There were also more complex structures known as turricula, which were small towers with steps inside. The player would drop the dice into the top, and they would clatter down the internal steps, emerging at the bottom onto the board, guaranteeing a random roll. This auditory element, the sharp clatter of bone against ceramic, was the soundtrack of the Roman night. The boards themselves, known as tabulae lusoriae, varied greatly in quality. Wealthy patrons might play on boards of polished wood or stone with inlaid markings. In the Popinae, however, the boards were often scratched directly into the wood of the table or carved into the stone pavement outside. Many surviving examples show these makeshift boards etched into the steps of basilicas or the flooring of public spaces, permanent reminders of the idle hours spent there. The games played on these boards were not just about rolling high numbers. They involved strategy and movement, similar to modern backgammon. One such game was Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum, or the game of 12 lines. It involved moving pieces across a board divided into 3 rows of 12 markings, with the movement dictated by the roll of the dice. While the tesserae relied purely on the numerical value, the tali or knucklebones had a more complex scoring system based on the combination of faces that landed up. 4 knucklebones were usually thrown at once. The values were not simply added together. Instead, specific combinations were given names and values. The lowest throw was the dog, where all 4 bones showed the value of 1. This was the losing throw, often greeted with groans and the loss of the stake. The highest throw was the Venus, where all 4 bones showed different faces, 1, 3, 4, and 6. This was the stroke of luck every gambler prayed for. Between the dog and the Venus were numerous other combinations, often named after gods, heroes, or even specific types of people, each carrying its own weight in the game. The stakes in these games could be incredibly high, despite the legal prohibitions. It was not uncommon for men to wager their tunics, their cloaks, or the rings on their fingers if their coin purses ran empty. The addiction to the alea was a well-documented phenomenon. Roman satirists and moralists frequently complained about the madness of the dice. Juvenal, a poet writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, lamented that men would bring their entire capital chests to the gaming table rather than just a purse. He described the tense atmosphere where thousands of sesterces were lost in silence, save for the rattling of the cup. This intensity created a unique social environment within the tavern. For the duration of the game, social ranks could be temporarily blurred. A freedman with luck on his side could bankrupt a knight. However, this blurring of lines was dangerous, and fights were frequent. We must also consider the layout of the popina in relation to these games. The front room, visible from the street, was often just for quick service. But many popinae had back rooms or even cellars. It was in these secluded areas that the serious gambling took place. Curtains or wooden partitions might separate the casual drinker from the hardcore gambler. This separation served a dual purpose. It provided privacy for the patrons and a layer of plausible deniability for the tavern owner if the authorities came checking. The owner, or kaupo, was often a central figure in this ecosystem. They provided the equipment, held the stakes, and sometimes acted as a loan shark for those who wanted to chase their losses. The reputation of these kaupons was generally poor. They were seen as enablers of vice, often accused of watering down wine and cheating their customers. As the night deepened, the atmosphere in these gambling dens would become heavier. The oil in the lamps would burn low, the air would grow stale, but the games would continue. The players were driven by a concept the Romans called fortuna. Fortuna was not just blind chance. She was a goddess, capricious and powerful. To win at dice was to be favored by the gods. To lose was a sign of divine disfavor. This spiritual dimension added a layer of gravity to the proceedings. Players would often invoke the names of deities before casting the dice, promising votive offerings in exchange for a Venus throw. In this way, the sordid environment of the tavern was linked to the sacred geography of the city. The same man who offered a sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter in the morning might be found cursing Fortuna in a popina at midnight. Beyond the immediate thrill of the dice and the spiritual invocation of Fortuna, the popina served another crucial function in Roman society. It was a place of unauthorized social mixing. In the rigid hierarchy of Rome, where every individual had a defined place based on birth, wealth, and citizenship, the knight offered a temporary suspension of these rules. While the law tried to keep the orders separate, senators were legally forbidden from owning or even frequenting such low establishments. The reality was often quite different. Historical accounts are filled with anecdotes of the elite slumming it. Emperors like Nero, Otho, and Vitellius were notorious for prowling the taverns of the city in disguise. They would don the cucullus, a hooded cloak that obscured the face, or wear the simple tunic of a freedman to blend in with the crowd. For the wealthy elite, the tavern offered a grimy authenticity and a break from the suffocating etiquette of the court. For the regular patrons, the presence of a disguised aristocrat added a layer of tension and rumor to the night's proceedings, though often the disguise was a thin veil that everyone politely pretended not to see. However, if one stepped out of the smoky, lamplit warmth of the tavern and onto the streets of Rome at night, they would encounter a very different sensory experience. We might assume that the city slept when the sun went down, but for the inhabitants of the urbs aeterna, night was synonymous with noise. This was due to a specific piece of legislation known as the Lex Iulia Municipalis, passed by Julius Caesar around 45 BC. To alleviate the lethal congestion of the narrow Roman streets, this law banned heavy transport wagons from the city center during the daylight hours, specifically from sunrise until the 10th hour of the day, roughly late afternoon. The result was that the logistical heartbeat of the empire began to beat only after dusk. As the shopkeepers closed their shutters and the citizens retreated to their apartments, the city gates opened to a flood of commercial traffic. Huge four-wheeled wagons, known as plaustra, laden with timber for construction, stone for monuments, and amphorae of oil and wine for the markets, would rumble over the basalt paving stones. The noise was reportedly deafening. The satirist Juvenal famously complained that insomnia causes more deaths amongst Roman invalids than any other factor, and he blamed the wagons. The rumbling of the iron-rimmed wheels on the stone blocks, the cracking of whips, and the shouting of drovers cursing at their oxen created a cacophony that echoed through the narrow canyon-like streets formed by the tall insulae. For the average Roman trying to sleep in a third-floor apartment with thin walls, the night was not a time of silence, but a time of industrial clamor. Navigating these streets on foot was a perilous endeavor, not just because of the traffic, but because of the darkness. Ancient Rome had no public street lighting. There were no lampposts to guide the way. On a moonless night, the city was plunged into absolute blackness, broken only by the occasional light from a shrine or the open door of a tavern. This darkness necessitated a specific social role, the lanternarius. Wealthy Romans who ventured out at night would never do so alone. They would be accompanied by a slave or a retinue of slaves, one of whom was the designated torchbearer. The lanternarius would carry a lantern, typically made of bronze with thin sheets of translucent horn or bladder to protect the flame from the wind. This small circle of light was a bubble of safety in the vast, dark ocean of the city. To walk without a light was to invite disaster, whether from tripping over the uneven pavement, stepping into the open drains, or falling victim to the human dangers of the night. The human dangers were significant. The darkness provided cover for footpads, thieves, and gangs of unruly youths. It was a common pastime for young, wealthy aristocrats, fueled by the wine of the Papani, to roam the streets, harassing passers-by. They would toss people in blankets, beat them, or assault them, confident that their status and the cover of darkness would protect them from consequences. To counter this chaos, Rome relied on the vigiles urbani, the watchmen of the city. Originally formed by Augustus primarily as a fire brigade, the vigiles evolved into a nocturnal police force. Organized into 7 cohorts, each responsible for 2 of the city's 14 regions. They patrolled the streets, carrying axes and buckets for fires, but also cudgels for maintaining order. Encountering a patrol of vigiles was a mixed blessing for the nocturnal wanderer. While they offered protection against thieves, they were also enforcers of the state's curfew on suspicious gatherings. They had the authority to arrest anyone found wandering without a legitimate reason or a light. They would drag runaways or brawlers to their station houses, the excubitoria, for temporary holding. The walls of one such station, the excubitorium of the 7th cohort in the Trastevere district, preserve graffiti scratched by bored watchmen almost 2,000 years ago, giving us a glimpse into their long, tedious shifts guarding the sleeping city. Returning to the interior of the establishments where people sought refuge from these streets, we find that dice were not the only form of gaming. For those who preferred skill over sheer luck, or perhaps for those who had grown tired of the erratic nature of the tali, there were strategy games. The most intellectual and respected of these was Ludus Latrunculorum, often simply called Latrunculi. The name translates roughly to the game of mercenaries or game of highwaymen. It was a game of pure strategy, often compared to modern chess or checkers, though its rules were distinct and reflected the Roman obsession with military tactics. The board for Latrunculi was a grid of squares, the size of which could vary. Archaeological finds show boards of 8 by 8, 8 by 12, or even larger dimensions. The playing pieces, or calculi, were made of glass, bone, or stone, usually in two distinguishing colors like white and black or white and red. Unlike dice games, there was no element of chance here. The goal was to capture the opponent's pieces. The capture mechanic was unique. A piece was taken if it was hemmed in between two enemy pieces, either vertically or horizontally, a method known as custodial capture. This mimicked the military maneuver of flanking and surrounding an enemy unit. Ancient writers describe the intense concentration required for Latrunculi. A player would be praised for their ability to see moves ahead, to sacrifice a piece to gain a positional advantage, or to break a deadlock. It was a game of patience and geometric visualization. The poet Ovid, in his advice on love, even suggests that a woman should know how to play Latrunculi well, as it was a social skill that could attract a partner. In the tavern context, a game of Latrunculi would have been a quieter affair than the raucous dice tables. It would draw a different crowd, or perhaps the same crowd in a more contemplative mood. Spectators would gather around the board, analyzing the moves, much like the kibitzers of later eras. The silence of the players would be punctuated only by the click of the stone pieces moving across the grid and the distant rumble of the heavy wagons outside. There was also a simpler game, often played by children, but also found in the taverns, called rota, or the wheel. The board for rota resembles a wheel with 8 spokes. It is essentially a more complex version of tic-tac-toe. Players had 3 pieces each and would take turns placing them on the intersections of the spokes and the rim. Once all pieces were placed, they would take turns moving them to an adjacent empty spot. The goal was to get 3 in a row through the center. While deceptively simple, rota boards are carved into the pavements of the Roman Forum and the steps of the Basilica Julia, indicating that it was a favorite way to pass the time for idlers, guards, and anyone waiting for court proceedings to finish. The culture of the tavern also included entertainment that went beyond gaming. While the state-sanctioned theater was a daylight activity, the Papanae provided a venue for more informal and often more risque performances. It was not uncommon for a tavern owner to employ a flute player or a dancer to entertain the guests. The music would have been simple and rhythmic, played on the tibia or the cithara. The tibicinae were often women of low social status, sometimes slaves, and their presence added to the allure of the tavern as a place of sensory indulgence. The walls of the taverns themselves tell us a story about the people who frequented them. Graffiti was the social media of ancient Rome. In the preserved cities of Vesuvius, the walls of bars are covered in scratched messages. Some are simple accountings of debts. Felix owes 5 asses. Others are boasts of sexual conquests or insults directed at rivals. There are advertisements for the quality of the wine or the services of the staff. One famous inscription from a tavern in Pompeii lists the prices of wine. For 1, as you can drink wine. For 2, you can drink the best. For 4, you can drink Falernian. Falernian was the premier vintage of the time, the Grand Cru of Rome. The fact that it was allegedly available in a street-side tavern, though likely a counterfeit version, speaks to the aspirational nature of the nightlife. Even in a dive bar, a Roman could pretend to be a connoisseur, sipping Falernian while gambling away his day's wages on a throw of the knucklebones. Food was also an integral part of this nocturnal economy. The popana was essentially a fast food joint. The kitchen was usually open to the street, with large cauldrons set into the masonry counter kept warm over a fire. The menu was limited but hearty, designed to soak up the wine. Chickpeas, lentils, and broad beans were staples, often served as a stew. Sausages, black pudding, and salted fish were also common. The Romans had a particular fondness for garum, the fermented fish sauce that was used as a condiment on almost everything. The smell of warm garum, combined with wood smoke and unwashed bodies, would have been the olfactory signature of the Roman tavern. While the tavern walls of Pompeii recorded the petty debts and boasts of the common people, the marble halls of the Palatine Hill witnessed gambling on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The hypocrisy of the Roman state regarding these forbidden pleasures is nowhere more evident than in the habits of the emperors themselves. While they upheld the leges aleatorii that forbade citizens from betting money, many of the Caesars were hopelessly addicted to the thrill of the dice. This was not a secret vice kept hidden in the imperial bedchambers. For some, it was a defining characteristic of their rule. Take Augustus, the first emperor, the man who claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He was a man known for his austere public image and his promotion of traditional family values. Yet, in his private letters, preserved by the historian Suetonius, Augustus freely admitted to his love of gambling. In a letter to his stepson Tiberius, he described a supper during the festival of the Quinquatria, where he played all day long. He wrote, "We gambled like old men, neither boldly nor for high stakes." However, in another letter, he confessed to losing 20,000 sesterces because he was too generous, refusing to claim the stakes when he won and paying up when he lost. He estimated that had he played strictly, he would have won 50,000. To put this in perspective, a Roman legionary soldier earned 900 sesterces a year. Augustus lost a soldier's 20-year career earnings in a single afternoon of old men's gaming. If Augustus was a recreational gambler, the Emperor Claudius was a professional one. He took the pastime so seriously that he wrote a book on the art of dice playing. Unfortunately, this work has been lost to history, but its existence suggests a level of analytical engagement with the game that went beyond mere chance. Claudius's dedication was such that he refused to let his official duties interrupt his gaming. He had a special carriage constructed with a stabilized gaming board fixed to the floor, designed so that the vibrations of the road would not disrupt the dice. This allowed him to continue playing while traveling between Rome and his country estates, turning the imperial commute into a mobile casino. The stakes escalated further with later emperors. Nero, known for his excesses in all things, reportedly staked 400,000 sesterces on a single throw of the dice. He was the high roller of the ancient world. Commodus, the emperor who fancied himself a gladiator, was said to have turned the imperial palace into a gambling house, depleting the treasury to fund his habits. The biographer Lampridius claims that when Commodus ran out of money, he would simulate legal cases against wealthy citizens, execute them, and confiscate their estates simply to replenish his gambling funds. Here, the vice of the tavern became a mechanism of state terror. But whether the game was played for copper coins in a smoky popana or for estates in the imperial palace, the desire to tilt the odds in one's favor was universal. This brings us to the mechanics of cheating. Archaeological excavations have uncovered hundreds of Roman dice across the empire, and a surprising percentage of them are crooked. The Romans were masters of engineering, and they applied this skill to deception. The most common form of cheating involved loaded dice. A craftsman would carefully drill a tiny hole into one side of the bone or ivory cube. Into this cavity, they would insert a small weight, usually a drop of lead or a fleck of gold. The hole would then be plugged with a mixture of wax and bone dust, polished until it was invisible to the naked eye. The weight would alter the center of gravity, making the die far more likely to land with the weighted side down and the opposite number facing up. For example, to roll a 6, one would weight the side marked with the 1. More sophisticated cheats involve the shape of the die itself. Some surviving dice are slightly out of square. They are not perfect cubes, but rather rectangular prisms, flattened ever so slightly on two opposite sides. A die shaped like this will naturally tend to land on the larger, flatter surfaces rather than the smaller, narrower ones. A skilled player, knowing the bias of the die, could manipulate the game with devastating effect. There were even mechanical marvels, magnetic dice used in conjunction with a prepared board, though these were rare and belonged to the realm of professional illusionists. The prevalence of such trickery explains the obsessive design of the fritillus and turricula mentioned earlier. The tower was not just a convenient accessory, it was a security device. By forcing the dice to tumble through internal baffles, the players ensured that no amount of sleight of hand, known as palming, could influence the roll. In a society where trust was low and the stakes were high, the distinct sound of the dice rattling through the tower was the only guarantee of a fair game. While dice were the engines of pure chance, the board games required a different kind of mental engagement. We touched upon the strategy game, La Trunculi, but the most popular board game in the Roman world, the true ancestor of our modern backgammon, was Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum, the game of 12 lines. The layout of this game offers a window into the Roman mind's love for order and progression. The board consisted of 3 rows of 12 markings each. The markings could be simple lines, circles, or sometimes letters. In fact, many boards found in public places use 6-letter words to form the 12 spaces. A common example reads, Venari, lavari, ludere, ridere, aucest, vivere. This translates roughly to hunt, to bathe, to play, to laugh, that is to live. The game board itself became a philosophical statement about the good life. The rules, reconstructed by scholars from varying sources, involved 2 players sitting across from each other. Each player had 15 pieces, usually black and white discs. The movement was determined by the roll of 3 dice. The objective was likely to enter pieces onto the board, move them through the 3 rows in a specific track, perhaps entering on the middle row, moving to the top, and exiting from the bottom, and bear them off the board, exactly as in backgammon. Crucially, the game included the mechanic of hitting a lone piece. If a player's piece landed on a space occupied by a single enemy piece, that enemy piece was sent back to the start. This introduced a high level of risk management. Players had to decide whether to advance rapidly with single pieces, risking capture, or to move slowly, building points that were safe from attack. This tension between aggression and defense mirrored Roman military doctrine. The game was slow, rhythmic, and deeply absorbing. It was the perfect way to kill the long, empty hours of the night. But the night in Rome was not just for games. As the hours wore on and the wine jars emptied, the popinae and the streets around them hosted other forms of commerce. We must address the reality of the sex trade, which was inextricably linked to the culture of the tavern and the night. In Roman legal and social terms, the waitress in a tavern was often assumed to be a prostitute. The distinction between serving food and serving one's body was, in the eyes of the law, often non-existent for women of this class. The Roman attitude toward this was pragmatic and unromantic. It was a business transaction, regulated and taxed like any other. The state levied a tax on prostitutes, and the sheer volume of revenue it generated ensured that no emperor ever seriously tried to ban it. The night walkers, or noctilucae, were a common sight. They would gather near the porticos of public buildings, around the Circus Maximus, and in the Subura district. The Subura deserves specific mention as the epicenter of Roman nightlife. Located in the valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, it was the most densely populated and dangerous part of the city. It was a maze of narrow alleys, towering, rickety apartment blocks, and shops. It was noisy, dirty, and vibrant. While the rich lived on the breezy heights of the Palatine or the Esquiline, the Subura was where the working poor, the immigrants, the criminals, and the artists lived. It was the belly of the beast. Walking through the Subura at night, the sensory input would be overwhelming. The smell of cooking fires would mix with the stench of the open drains. The sounds of arguments, lovers' trysts, and barking dogs would filter down from the open windows of the insulae. It was here that the forbidden pleasures were not forbidden at all. They were simply the fabric of daily survival. One interesting aspect of this nightlife was the culture of the bathhouses. While most bathing took place during the day, some smaller, private baths, known as balnea, operated into the night. These were often less scrupulous than the great imperial thermae. Night bathing had a reputation for promiscuity and licentiousness. With the dim lighting of oil lamps reflecting on the water and the steam obscuring vision, the night baths were places where the strict social codes could be further eroded. However, for all the talk of pleasure, there was a harsh economic reality underpinning this nightlife. The money lost at the gaming tables had to come from somewhere. The specter of debt hung heavy over the Roman gambler. In the early Republic, a debtor could be sold into slavery if he could not pay. By the imperial period, this brutal law had been reformed, but the consequences of insolvency were still dire. A man who lost his fortune lost his status. He became infamous, a person of ill repute. He lost his right to give testimony in court, to vote, or to stand for office. The shame was public and permanent. Yet, despite the risk of ruin, the risk of arrest by the vigils, and the risk of violence in the dark alleys, the people of Rome continued to pour into the streets when the sun went down. The night offered something the day could not: anonymity. In the darkness, under the flickering light of a tavern lamp, a man was just a player, and his fate depended not on his lineage, but on the roll of the dice. The passion for gambling was not contained within the four walls of the popina, nor limited to the roll of the dice. While the dice games provided a steady, low-level hum of risk throughout the city, the true seismic shifts of fortune occurred in relation to the Circus Maximus. To understand the Roman nightlife, one must understand the fanaticism surrounding the chariot races. The races themselves were daytime events, grand spectacles of speed and dust. But the aftermath, the betting, the arguing, and the violence belonged to the night. The chariot teams were organized into 4 factions, distinguished by the colors of their tunics: the reds, the whites, the blues, and the greens. Later, the Emperor Domitian attempted to add purples and golds, but they never truly caught on. These factions were far more than sports teams. They were powerful syndicates, social clubs, and political pressure groups rolled into one. A Roman citizen defined himself by his color. The devotion was absolute. Pliny the Younger, a man of letters, wrote dismissively of the fans. If the colors were swapped in the middle of the race, they would transfer their favor and enthusiasm to the very same horses and men they were shouting for a moment ago. When the races ended and the sun set, the factions retreated to their respective headquarters and the taverns that supported them. Here, the gambling reached fever pitch. The betting on chariot races was technically legal, unlike the dice games, which gave it a veneer of legitimacy. However, the sums involved were astronomical, but it was not just money that changed hands, it was influence. The Blues and Greens, the two most dominant factions in the later empire, essentially ran the streets at night. Their supporters formed gangs that would roam the city, chanting their slogans and attacking rivals. This factional violence adds another layer to the forbidden nature of the Roman night. It was a tribal warfare fought in the dark alleys. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus describes the idlers of Rome spending their entire nights in wine shops, arguing passionately about the races, their faces deformed by anxiety as they waited for the results or debated the merits of a particular driver. These arguments frequently turned into riots. The tavern, therefore, was not just a place of relaxation. It was a pressure cooker of adrenaline left over from the day's spectacle. This obsession led to one of the most sinister and fascinating aspects of Roman nocturnal activity, the creation of deficciones, or curse tablets. For a gambler, skill and luck were sometimes not enough. To ensure a win, one had to cripple the opposition. This was done through black magic. At night, under the cover of darkness, a gambler or a fan would take a thin sheet of lead, a material associated with the coldness of death and the underworld, and scratch a curse onto it using a bronze stylus. These curses were brutally specific. They would invoke the names of chthonic deities, gods of the underworld like Pluto, Proserpine, or Hermes, in his role as the guide of souls. The text would ask these spirits to bind, torture, or kill a specific charioteer or horse. A typical curse might read, "I conjure you, demon, whoever you are. Torture and kill the horses of the green faction, and crash the driver Felix. Break his arms, his legs, his head." Once inscribed, the tablet would be rolled up or folded and pierced with a nail, symbolically fixing the curse. The placement of these tablets was crucial and required a terrifying nocturnal journey. To be effective, the tablet had to be placed in a location with a strong connection to the spirit world. This meant sneaking into the Circus Maximus at night to bury the lead sheet directly under the starting gates or the turning posts. Alternatively, the gambler might venture into the necropolises that lined the roads outside the city walls. They would find a fresh grave, preferably of someone who had died violently or prematurely, and slip the tablet into the earth, using the restless spirit of the deceased as a messenger to the gods below. The Roman night was thus populated not just by drunks and watchmen, but by superstitious citizens creeping through graveyards, clutching lead curses, driven by the desperate hope of a gambling win. If the deficciones represented the dark, magical undercurrent of the night, the commissatio represented its formalized social structure. For the upper classes, the evening meal, the cena, was followed by a drinking party known as the commissatio. While this took place in private villas rather than public taverns, it operated under strict rules that mirrored the controlled chaos of the gambling dens. The key figure in these gatherings was the arbiter bibendi, the master of drinking. This role was determined by a throw of the dice, specifically the Venus throw of the knuckle bones. Once selected, the arbiter bibendi had absolute dictatorial power over the guests for the duration of the night. His primary duty was to decide the mixture of the wine. The Romans rarely drank wine neat. To do so was considered barbaric, a habit of Scythians or Gauls, and was believed to lead to madness and death. Instead, wine was always mixed with water. The arbiter Bibendi would determine the ratio based on the mood he wished to set. A ratio of 1 part wine to 3 parts. Water was considered safe for serious conversation. A ratio of 1 to 1 was a recipe for a riotous, drunken night. He also decided how many cups each guest had to drink and at what pace. If the master commanded a toast, everyone had to drink. If he commanded a game, everyone had to play. It was a microcosm of the Roman state, an autocracy established by chance, governing the consumption of pleasure. The wine itself, the fuel of these nights, varied immensely in quality. We mentioned the legendary Falernian, but the average Roman in Apopana was drinking something far different. The most common drink for the lower classes, soldiers and slaves, was pasca. Pasca was not strictly wine. It was a mixture of sour wine or vinegar, water, and flavoring herbs. While it sounds unappealing to modern palates, it was safe to drink, thirst-quenching, and cheap. It was the energy drink of the ancient world. For those with a few more coins, there was mulsum, a mixture of wine and honey. This was often served as an aperitif. In the winter nights, taverns would serve calida, warm wine heated with spices, similar to mulled wine. The distinct aroma of heated wine, cloves, and saffron would waft from the open counters of the thermopolia, drawing in the shivering customers from the street. The thermopolium is a vital setting for our understanding of the night. These were the snack bars of antiquity. The counters, often decorated with fragments of colorful marble, had large earthenware jars embedded in them. Interestingly, archaeological analysis of these jars suggests they often held dried goods like nuts, lentils, and grains rather than just liquids. The hot food would be prepared in the back and brought out. The thermopolium was designed for the Roman who lived his life in public. Since the apartments of the poor were dark, cramped, and fire-prone, the thermopolium was their kitchen and dining room. It was where the community gathered. In these establishments, the barriers between the specific types of forbidden activities blurred. A man might enter for a cup of hot kalida, stay for a game of dice, get involved in a heated argument about the green faction, and end up hiring a prostitute who was waiting in the shadows of the portico. The state's attempt to regulate these spaces was constant, but largely futile. Emperors frequently passed sumptuary laws trying to limit what could be sold in these taverns. The Emperor Tiberius, in a fit of austerity, banned the sale of pastries. Claudius tried to shut down the popinae entirely and forbade the sale of cooked meat and hot water. Vespasian decreed that nothing could be sold in bars except for beans and peas. These laws were ostensibly to encourage public morality and thrift, but they were also about public order. The state knew that a well-fed, drunk crowd was a dangerous crowd. However, the repetition of these laws, the fact that nearly every emperor had to reissue them, proves they were ignored. The Romans demanded their nightlife, their sausages, and their warm wine, and the tavern owners found ways to provide them. One cannot discuss the Roman night without mentioning the specific architecture of the doors. This might seem a trivial detail, but it was central to the experience of the city. Roman doors were heavy, wooden, and often secured with complex locks. The locking up at night was a ritual. Keys in the Roman world were essentially large bronze rings with wards, often worn on the finger like jewelry to prevent theft. But for those returning late, gaining entry was a challenge. There were no doorbells. One had to pound on the door and shout for the porter. The Ianitor was usually a slave who slept directly behind the door in the entryway. In poetry and satire, the figure of the Ianitor is a constant obstacle. The excluded lover is a trope of Roman love elegy, a young man weeping on the doorstep, singing to the closed door, begging the Ianitor to unbar the way. This literary image reflects a reality of the Roman knight. It was a world of barriers. The heavy doors of the insulae shut out the dangers of the street, creating sharp divisions between the exposed, dangerous public space and the secure private interior. Inside the Popina, however, the doors were always open. The threshold was a permeable boundary. As the night wore on, the distinction between the classes, so rigid in the daylight, began to dissolve in the wine cups. We have graffiti evidence of weavers drinking with soldiers and mule drivers rolling dice with actors. The tavern was the great leveler. It was a place where the Roman concept of dignitas, the reputation and standing of a citizen, could be temporarily staked and lost, or forgotten entirely in the haze of smoke and noise. This mixing was particularly prevalent in the port cities like Ostia. Here, the nightlife had an international flavor. Sailors from Alexandria, merchants from Gaul, and grain traders from Africa would converge in the taverns near the harbor. The languages spoken would be a polyglot mix of Latin, Greek, Punic, and Aramaic. The games played might include foreign variants brought from the edges of the empire. In these spaces, the Roman nightlife became a Mediterranean nightlife, a melting pot of vices and virtues imported from across the known world. As the constellations wheeled overhead and the oil in the lamps finally ran dry, the denizens of the Roman night faced the inevitable approach of dawn. The transition from the chaotic liberty of the night to the rigid duty of the day was a stark one. But before the sun rose, the Romans had to contend with the physical consequences of their nocturnal indulgences. The ancient world was rife with remedies for the after-effects of wine and excess, revealing a society that was intimately familiar with the hangover. Pliny the Elder, the indefatigable chronicler of natural history, dedicated sections of his work to these cures. His advice provides a fascinating glimpse into the Roman medicine cabinet. He suggested that eating raw owl's eggs was a potent remedy for the effects of wine, though he admitted their scarcity made them a luxury cure. A more accessible preventative measure was the consumption of roasted sheep's lungs before drinking. However, the most widely accepted panacea for the morning after was cabbage. Cato the Elder, a stern traditionalist, wrote extensively on the virtues of brassica. He advised that if one intended to drink heavily at a dinner, they should eat raw cabbage, dressed with vinegar beforehand and more afterwards. It was believed to eat up the wine in the stomach. For the headache that followed a night in the Popina, Romans might bind their heads with garlands of flowers, particularly roses or parsley, which were thought to constrict the blood vessels and cool the brow. This belief explains the ubiquitous presence of floral wreaths in depictions of Roman banquets. They were not merely decorative, but medicinal accessories worn in anticipation of the wine's potency. While the common people sought relief in cabbage and vinegar, the philosophers of Rome looked at the nightlife with a critical, often disdainful eye. To the Stoics, the loss of self-control in gambling and drinking was a form of slavery. Seneca the Younger, writing in the 1st century AD, offers us the most vivid and cutting critique of this lifestyle. In his Moral Letters to Lucilius, he describes a specific class of people he calls the lucifugae, or light shunners. These were men who had completely inverted the natural order, sleeping during the day and waking only at sunset to begin their revels. Seneca compares these people to birds of the night, living in the shadows not out of necessity, but out of a perverted desire to be different. He argues that their very souls have become dark. He describes their nights as being filled with restless inactivity, a busyness that achieves nothing. For Seneca, the gambler playing dice until dawn is not enjoying freedom. He is trapped by the tyranny of hope and fear. He writes of the noise that surrounds these people, the shouting, the music, the brawls, and contrasts it with the silence required for wisdom. In a famous passage, he complains about living above a bathhouse and being bombarded by the sounds of groans, splashes, and the smack of the masseur's hand, noting that true peace comes from within, regardless of the chaos outside. This philosophical tension highlights a fundamental duality in the Roman mindset. On one hand, there was the ideal of gravitas, a seriousness of purpose, self-control, and duty to the state. On the other hand, there was the undeniable reality of the human need for release. The popina, the dice tower, and the wine cup were the safety valves for a society under immense pressure. The state implicitly understood this. As long as the violence of the factions remained contained within the night, and as long as the gambling did not bankrupt the senatorial class entirely, the forbidden pleasures were tolerated as a necessary evil. But all nights must end. The conclusion of the Roman night was marked not by a sudden silence, but by a shift in the soundscape. As the heavy transport wagons finished their deliveries and rumbled out of the city gates before the sunrise ban took effect, a new sound began to fill the streets, the shuffling of feet. This was the beginning of the salutatio, the morning ritual of clientage. In the Roman social system, almost every man was a client to a more powerful patron. Every morning, at the crack of dawn, clients were expected to gather at the homes of their patrons to pay their respects and receive the sportula, a small gift of food or money. The gambler who had spent his last sesterce on a dog throw at the tavern now had to wash his face, straighten his toga, and rush to the house of a senator to stand in line. The popinae would close their shutters. The vigils would return to their barracks, extinguishing their torches. The prostitutes would retreat from the porticos. The illusion of equality that existed in the tavern, where a lucky roll made a king, evaporated with the first light. The rigid hierarchy of the day reasserted itself. The senator put on his broad-striped tunic, the equestrian his narrow-striped one, and the plebeian his rough wool. The masks of the night were put away. Yet, the physical evidence of the night remained. The scratched graffiti on the walls, the worn steps of the basilica where the gaming boards were carved, and the lead curse tablets buried in the earth were permanent testaments to the hidden life of the city. Rome was not just the city of legions and laws. It was a city of dreamers and desperate risk-takers. The empire was built on order, but it was sustained in part by the chaotic energy of its knights. As we leave the ancient city now, imagine the sun rising over the Esquiline hill, casting long shadows across the forum. The air is cool and smells of wood smoke and morning dew. The shout of the mule drivers is replaced by the chant of priests opening the temples. The game is over. The dice are packed away in their leather pouches, and the city turns its face once again toward the business of conquering the world. So ends our journey into the forbidden pleasures of Rome. We have walked the dark streets, sat at the sticky tables of the taverns, and watched the fortunes of men rise and fall on the turn of a knucklebone. It is a world that feels distant, yet strangely familiar in its desires and its follies. Thank you for joining me on this trip back in time. I hope the sounds of the Roman night have been a comfort to you. If you are still awake, let the quiet history of these ancient games drift you away. If you are already asleep, may your dreams be as grand as the eternal city itself. Now, back in time to sit quietly in the simple classrooms of the ancient world, observing the rigorous discipline and the structured days that shaped the minds of young Romans. So if you are new to the channel or returning, liking the video significantly helps. Also, please let me know where you're listening in from and what time it is for you. Now get comfortable and let's begin. To understand the education of a Roman child, we must first understand the Roman concept of childhood itself. Unlike the modern view, which often romanticizes childhood as a period of innocence and freedom, the Romans viewed it as a time of weakness and potentiality that required strict molding. The Latin word for child, infans, literally means one who cannot speak. This period of infancy was not merely biological. It was a legal and social category that lasted until the age of 7. During these early years, the education was informal, domestic, and largely in the hands of the women of the household and specific enslaved caregivers. The journey of a Roman child began with a ritual of acceptance. Upon birth, the infant was placed at the feet of the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. It was his prerogative to lift the child up, acknowledging it as his own and accepting the responsibility to raise it. Once accepted, the child entered a world governed by ritual and superstition designed to protect their fragile life. On the dies lustricus, the 9th day for boys and the 8th for girls, the child was purified and given their name, the praenomen. It was on this day they received the bulla. The bulla was a crucial object in the life of a Roman boy. It was an amulet, usually a round locket made of gold for the wealthy or leather and cloth for the poor, worn around the neck. Inside, it contained charms believed to ward off the invidia, the evil eye. This locket was not just jewelry, it was a marker of status, identifying the wearer as a freeborn son of a citizen. He would wear it every day of his life until he reached adulthood. For girls, a similar protective function was served by the lunula, a crescent moon-shaped amulet. These small physical weights around their necks were the first uniform of their education, a constant reminder of their identity and the dangers of the world. In the earliest years, the primary educator was the mother. In the idealized Roman tradition, the matrona was the guardian of the home and the moral compass of the family. Historians like Tacitus lamented the decline of this tradition in the imperial period, looking back fondly to the days when mothers like Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers, personally oversaw the upbringing of their sons. Cornelia was famous not for her wealth, but for her education and her cultivation of her sons' eloquence. This domestic education focused on mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. Before a child learned to read a scroll, they learned to mimic the stoic posture, the respectful silence, and the obedience required of a Roman citizen. However, in many wealthy households, the practical day-to-day care and early instruction fell to the nutrix, or wet nurse. The nutrix was often a slave or a freedwoman, frequently of Greek origin. Her influence was considered profound, extending even to the child's speech. Roman educational theorists, such as Quintilian, writing in the 1st century AD, stressed the importance of choosing a nutrix who spoke properly. He believed that a child absorbed language like a sponge, and if the nurse spoke with a barbaric accent or used incorrect grammar, the child would acquire these faults indelibly. Thus, the nursery was the first language lab, where the sounds of Latin and often Greek first shaped the child's mind. As the child grew past the toddler stage but before formal schooling began, another figure entered their life, the pedagogus. It is from this word that we derive pedagogy, but the Roman pedagogus was not a teacher in the modern sense. He was a male slave, often older and trusted, assigned to be the constant companion of the young boy. He was a chaperone, a protector, and a disciplinarian. He walked the boy to school, carried his satchel, sat with him during lessons, and brought him home. The pedagogus was responsible for the child's moral safety and behavior. He taught the boy how to walk with a measured gait, how to dress properly, and how to eat with decorum. If the child misbehaved, the pedagogus had the authority to administer corporal punishment. This relationship was intense and constant. The child was never alone. He was always under the watchful eye of this shadow figure. The quality of the pedagogus varied. Some were highly educated Greeks who could help with homework and teach the boy a second language. Others were merely gruff guardians chosen for their loyalty rather than their intellect. Play was the other component of these early years, and even play was seen as a preparation for adult roles. Roman children had toys, many of which have been found in excavations. There were rattles made of terracotta or bronze for infants. Older children played with spinning tops, hoops driven by a stick, and dolls. The dolls found in the graves of Roman girls are particularly detailed. Some were made of ivory or bone, with articulated limbs that could be posed. These dolls were often dressed in miniature clothes and adorned with tiny jewelry, allowing the girl to practice the grooming and dressing rituals she would later perform as a wealthy woman. For boys, games often mimicked the military or political life. They played at being judges, soldiers, or charioteers. We have accounts of children hitching mice to toy carts or building miniature houses. Yet, even in play, there was a hierarchy. The leader of the game was often called the Rex, foreshadowing the political ambitions that would drive them as adults. At the age of 7, the period of infantia ended. This was a significant biological and social threshold. It was believed that at 7, a child began to develop reason and the capacity for structured learning. For girls, their education often remained centered in the home, focusing on domestic management, spinning, and weaving, though daughters of the elite were also taught to read and write. For boys, however, the age of 7 marked the transition from the private world of the nursery to the semi-public world of the ludus literarius, the primary school. This transition was not mandatory by law. Rome had no state-run public school system, but it was a social necessity for anyone who wished to function in society. The decision to send a child to school was made by the father, who also paid the fees. These fees were generally low, making basic literacy accessible to a relatively wide stratum of urban society, including shopkeepers, craftsmen, and some freedmen. The first day of school was not marked by a grand ceremony, but by a shift in routine. The boy would wake before dawn. The Roman school day began very early, often while it was still dark. He would dress in his tunic, put on his bolla, and step out into the cool morning air, followed closely by his pedagogus carrying the capsa, a cylindrical box holding his writing materials. The destination was the ludus. We should not imagine a dedicated school building with playgrounds and cafeterias. The Roman ludus was typically a humble affair. It was often located in a pergola, a gallery or a lean-to extension attached to a shop or a public building. Sometimes it was just a rented room on the ground floor of an apartment block, or even a section of a portico screened off by curtains. These curtains served to shield the students from the sights of the street, but they could do little to block the noise. The environment of the ludus was inextricably linked to the street. Martial, the poet, complains bitterly about the noise of the schools. He writes of being woken up before the roosters crow by the shouting of the schoolmaster and the sound of thwacks. The classroom was dusty. often cold in the winter and sparsely furnished. There were no desks. The students sat on backless wooden stools or benches, holding their work on their knees. The teacher, the ludi magister, sat on a chair with a back elevated on a dais to command the room. The ludi magister was a man of low social status. Teaching at this level was considered a humble trade, often performed by freedmen or men who had failed to secure better employment. The pay was poor and unreliable, often calculated per student per month. To make a living, the master had to take on as many students as possible, leading to crowded conditions. The class was not divided by age or ability in a structured way. Everyone sat together, working at their own pace under the master's eye. The tools of the trade were simple but specific. The primary writing surface for a beginner was the wax tablet. This was a rectangular piece of wood, often beech or fir, with a recessed center filled with beeswax. The wax was usually dyed black with soot to provide contrast. To write, the student used a stylus, a pointed instrument made of bone, bronze, or iron. The sharp end cut the letters into the wax, revealing the lighter wood beneath. The other end of the stylus was flattened or spatula-shaped. This was the eraser. To correct a mistake, the student would use the flat end to smooth the wax back over, obliterating the letter. This action, stylum vertere, became a metaphor for editing and revision. For more permanent work, or for advanced students, there was papyrus and ink. Papyrus was expensive, imported from Egypt, so it was not wasted on beginners. The ink was made from soot, gum, and water, stored in an inkwell. Reed pens were used to write on the papyrus. The tactile experience of learning was dominated by the smell of wax, the scratching of the stylus, and the coarse texture of the wooden benches. Once seated on their stools, the students began the slow, repetitive process of learning to read and write. The pedagogical method of the Roman ludus was entirely different from modern phonetic approaches. It was a system built on rigid memorization and rote repetition. The students did not learn the sounds of letters first. They learned their names and their shapes. The master would scratch a letter into the wax tablet, perhaps the letter A. The student was then required to trace over this groove with their own stylus, over and over again, until the muscle memory was formed. In the very beginning, the master might even hold the boy's hand, guiding it physically through the motions of the curves and lines. Only after the letters were mastered individually did they move on to syllables. This was a tedious phase. The class would chant in unison, ba, be, bi, bo, bu. Then ka, che, chi, ko, ku. This chanting, known as the cantare, was one of the reasons schools were so noisy. A passerby on the street would hear a chorus of young voices droning out these nonsensical combinations for hours on end. The goal was to drill the combinations so deeply into the mind that recognition became instantaneous. From syllables, they progressed to words, and then to short sentences. The sentences chosen for copywork were rarely random. They were almost always moral maxims, known as sententiae. The Romans believed that education should form the character as much as the mind. So, as a boy learned to write, he was also absorbing the ethical code of his society. He might copy out phrases like, "Labor conquers all things," or "Fortune favors the bold." He was literally carving these values into his tablet and his consciousness. Arithmetic was the other pillar of the primary curriculum, and it presented its own unique challenges. The Roman numeral system, I, V, X, L, C, D, M, is excellent for recording numbers, but it is terrible for calculation. Try to multiply 14 by 63 in your head, or even on paper using those symbols, and you will see the difficulty. Therefore, calculation was not done with written numbers. it was done with tools. The primary tool was the abacus. The Roman abacus was a portable device, often a metal plate with grooves or slots. In these slots moved small beads or stones called calculi. In fact, our modern words calculate and calculus come from these small pebbles used by Roman schoolboys. The student would move the beads to represent units, fives, tens, and hundreds. It was a tactile, visual way of doing math. The click-clack of the calculi moving in the bronze grooves was the other dominant sound of the classroom, alongside the chanting of syllables. In addition to the abacus, students learned a complex system of finger counting. This was not the simple counting to 10 we see in kindergartens today. It was a sophisticated international sign language of numbers that allowed a merchant or a scholar to represent numbers up to 10,000 using both hands. Specific bends of the fingers and positions of the thumb on the left hand represented units and tens, while the right hand handled hundreds and thousands. A student had to memorize these gestures perfectly. A mistake in finger positioning could mean a mistake in a business transaction later in life. This mental arithmetic, combined with the physical dexterity of the fingers, was highly tailored to the commercial needs of the empire. The atmosphere in which this learning took place was strict, often harsh. The Roman educational philosophy did not prioritize the happiness or creativity of the child. The objective was to break the will and mold the mind. The symbol of the teacher's authority was the ferula. This was a cane, typically made from the stalk of the giant fennel plant. It was light, but strong, and it stung sharply when applied to the hand or the back. Corporal punishment was the standard response to any failure. If a student wrote a letter sloppily, he was struck. If he forgot a syllable during the chant, he was struck. If he fidgeted on his bench, he was struck. The poet Horace immortalized his teacher, a man named Orbilius, by giving him the nickname Plagosus, which translates roughly to the thrasher or the flogger. Horace recalled how Orbilius would dictate the archaic verses of early Roman poets, while freely using the cane to ensure they were memorized. This fear of the master was a pervasive element of childhood. A fresco from Pompeii depicts a scene of school discipline that is both comical and terrifying. One student is horsed on the back of another, while a third holds his legs, and the master stands ready with a whip to beat the boy's exposed buttocks. The casual nature of this violence reflects the Roman belief that the body had to be subdued for the mind to learn. Pliny the Younger, usually a gentle soul, approved of this rigor, arguing that fear was a necessary component of respect. However, the school day was not endless. It typically finished around midday, allowing the children to return home for prandium, the lunch meal. Afternoons were often free, though for the ambitious, there might be more tutoring at home. There were also holidays. The schools closed on market days, which occurred every 8 days. They also closed for the major religious festivals, such as the Saturnalia in December and the Quinquatria in March. The Quinquatria was particularly special for schools because it was the festival of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and the patron of teachers. It was during this festival that the teachers received their payment, the Minerval, from the parents. For the majority of Roman boys, the sons of craftsmen, shopkeepers, and minor officials, education ended here, around the age of 11 or 12. They had learned to read signs, write basic letters, and calculate prices. They were now ready to enter the workforce, usually as apprentices to their fathers or to other tradesmen. They would swap the stylus for the hammer, the needle, or the plow. But for the sons of the elite, the senators, the equestrians, and the wealthy local aristocracy, the ludus literarius, was merely the prelude. Around the age of 11 or 12, they said goodbye to the ludi magister and advanced to the next stage, the school of the grammaticus. The grammaticus was a teacher of higher status. His school was often better appointed, perhaps in a more respectable building or a private villa. The curriculum here shifted from the mechanics of literacy to the art of literature. The primary language of instruction often switched to Greek, or at least became bilingual. Rome had a deep cultural inferiority complex regarding Greece. They conquered the Greeks militarily, but they acknowledged that the Greeks had conquered them culturally. To be a truly educated Roman, one had to be fluent in Greek. Under the grammaticus, the students studied the poets. Homer was the foundation. They would read the Iliad and the Odyssey, analyzing the meter, the vocabulary, and the moral lessons. They also studied the Roman poet Virgil, whose Aeneid eventually became the Latin equivalent of Homer. The method of study was exhaustive. This was called the enuratio poetarum. The teacher would read a passage aloud and then dissect it line by line. They analyzed the grammar. What case is this noun? Why is this verb in the subjunctive? They analyzed the rhetoric. What figure of speech is being used here? They analyzed the mythology and the geography mentioned in the text. A single few lines of verse could take an entire morning to unpack. The students were expected to memorize vast creative passages. A cultivated Roman man was expected to be able to quote Homer or Virgil at length from memory to support an argument, or simply to show off at a dinner party. The grammaticus also taught history, astronomy, and music, but only insofar as they were necessary to understand the references in the poetry. If a poem mentioned the constellation of the Bear, the teacher would give a brief lesson on astronomy. If it mentioned the Trojan War, he would lecture on history. This created a breadth of knowledge, but it was entirely literary focused. There was no scientific method, no experimentation. The world was learned through the filter of old books. Writing exercises became more complex. Students were introduced to the progymnasmata, a series of preliminary rhetorical exercises. They might be asked to retell a fable from Aesop in their own words, first expanding it, then condensing it. They might be asked to write a character sketch of a famous historical figure. What would Agamemnon say when he sacrificed his daughter? These exercises forced the student to step into the minds of others, to construct logical arguments, and to manipulate language with precision. The discipline in the school of the grammaticus remained strict, but the atmosphere was slightly more intellectual. The relationship between teacher and student could become closer, more like a mentorship. However, the pressure was immense. These boys were being groomed for power. They were being watched not just by their teachers, but by their fathers, who expected a return on their investment. A son who could not speak well, who stumbled over his Greek declensions, was a liability to the family's political future. Around the age of 15 or 16, a pivotal moment arrived in the life of a young Roman male. It was a transition that marked the end of boyhood and the beginning of civic life. This was not a private birthday celebration, but a public rite of passage known as the toga virilis ceremony, usually held during the festival of the Liberalia on March 17th. On this morning, the boy would stand before his household gods, the Lares and Penates. He would remove the bulla, the protective amulet he had worn around his neck since infancy. He would also take off the toga praetexta, the purple-bordered toga of childhood. These items were dedicated to the gods, physically and symbolically left on the altar of the past. In their place, he donned the toga virilis, or toga pura. This was a plain, unadorned white woolen toga. It was the uniform of an adult male citizen. The symbolism was stark. He was no longer a protected child. He was now a man who could stand in the forum, vote, and eventually hold office. Following the domestic ceremony, a procession would form. The father, accompanied by relatives, friends, and clients, would escort the young man to the forum. This walk was a public announcement of his new status. They would make their way to the tabularium, the record office, where his name was formally inscribed in the list of citizens. He was now a legal entity. But for the sons of the elite, adulthood did not mean the end of education. In fact, it marked the beginning of the most grueling and critical phase, the school of the reader. If the grammaticus taught a boy how to read and understand, the reader taught him how to speak and persuade. In the Roman Republic and Empire, public speaking was not a soft skill. It was the only skill that mattered. There were no mass media, no newspapers, no internet. Power was exercised solely through the spoken word, in the law courts, in the Senate, and in the public assemblies. A man who could not speak well was politically impotent. The definition of the ideal Roman orator, as formulated by Cato the Elder, was vir bonus dicendi peritus, a good man skilled in speaking. The reader's job was to forge this man. The training was intense, often lasting for several years into the young man's 20s. The classes were smaller, and the students were older, often engaging in fierce competition with one another. The curriculum was divided into two main types of exercises, suasoriae and controversi. These were declamations, practice speeches delivered on hypothetical topics. The suasoriae were the elementary exercises. They involved giving advice to a historical or mythological figure at a critical juncture. The student had to step into the shoes of a counselor. For example, a typical prompt might be, Alexander the Great has reached the Indian Ocean. Should he sail on or turn back? The student had to draft a speech arguing one side. He had to consider the character of Alexander, the geography, the morale of the troops, and the historical context. He had to use logic, emotion, and historical precedent. Another popular one was, Agamemnon considers sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia. Persuade him for or against. These exercises taught the students to analyze character and to weigh ethical dilemmas. Once the student mastered the suasoriae, he graduated to the controversiae. These were much more complex and often bizarre. They were mock judicial cases based on imaginary and frequently convoluted laws. The purpose was to teach legal reasoning and the ability to argue from a difficult position. A standard controversy scenario might look like this. The law. A rapist may be chosen by his victim to either be executed or to marry her without a dowry. The case. A man rapes two women in one night. One chooses his death, the other chooses marriage. Debate the outcome. The student would have to take a side, representing the executioner or the groom, and argue the legal precedents. Which woman's claim takes priority? Does the first act nullify the second? These cases were often melodramatic, featuring pirates, tyrants, disinherited sons, and poisoned stepmothers. Critics of the time, like Petronius, mocked these schools for being completely detached from reality. He complained that students were learning how to deal with pirates standing on chains on a beach, but not how to deal with a swindler in the actual Roman forum. Yet, the underlying skill being taught was mental agility. The student learned to find a loophole, to exploit an ambiguity in the law, and to sway a jury even when the facts were against them. But rhetoric was not just about the text. It was a physical performance. The reader was as much a drama coach as a logic teacher. Romans believed that the delivery was the most important part of a speech. If the delivery was poor, the best arguments would fail. The students were drilled on their voice. They learned how to project their breath from the diaphragm to fill a noisy forum without straining. They practiced intonation, learning when to thunder like Jupiter and when to whisper like a conspirator. They also studied gesture. The Roman body language of oratory was a codified system. There was a specific hand gesture for beginning a speech, another for narration, another for expressing anger, and another for concluding. The fingers were used like a musical instrument. For example, bringing the ring finger to the thumb while extending the other fingers was a gesture used to emphasize a precise point. Gripping the toga in a certain way could signal distress. Pacing was regulated. A frantic pace suggested a lack of control, while standing too still suggested a lack of passion. The students practiced in front of mirrors and in front of their peers. The criticism from the rhetor would be harsh and public. They were analyzing every twitch of the eyebrow, every shift of the stance. They even focused on the toga itself. A good orator knew how to use the folds of his toga for dramatic effect, how to let it fall from the shoulder in a moment of passion, or how to wrap it tight in a moment of solemnity. Beyond the classroom, the education of a young elite Roman included an apprenticeship in the real world known as the tirocinium fori, the recruits of the forum. The father would entrust his son to a distinguished senior senator, often a relative or a close political ally. The young man would become a shadow to this mentor. He would follow the senator to the forum every morning. He would stand silently at the back of the Senate House, listening to the debates of the great men of the day. He would watch court cases, observing the real-life application of the theories he was learning in school. He would see how alliances were made in the porticos and how deals were struck in the private rooms. This was education by osmosis. He learned the unwritten rules of Roman politics, the importance of dignity, the weight of family name, and the intricate web of patronage obligations. He would also learn the practicalities of administration. He might assist the senator in drafting letters, organizing archives, or managing agricultural estates. It was a period of earning one's stripes. He was expected to be seen but not heard, absorbing the gravitas of the older generation. For the very wealthiest and most ambitious, the final capstone of education was the grand tour to the East. Just as university students today might study abroad, young Romans traveled to Greece. Athens was the university city of the ancient world. There, they would sit at the feet of famous Greek philosophers, studying Stoicism, Epicureanism, or the Academy. They would travel to Rhodes, which was famous for its school of rhetoric. Julius Caesar, Cicero, and Brutus all made this pilgrimage. In Greece, they polished their Greek to a native level and engaged in the high-minded philosophical debates that were considered the mark of a truly civilized soul. It was a time to collect books, to see the great statues of the masters, and to network with the sons of other powerful families from across the Mediterranean. However, this highly intellectual and rhetorical education had a glaring omission by modern standards. There was almost no focus on science, mathematics, or technical skills. A Roman senator did not need to know how an aqueduct was built. He only needed to know how to persuade the Senate to fund it. He did not need to know the biology of a disease. He only needed to know the history of the plague to draw a moral lesson. The education was entirely human-centric and linguistic. It produced men who could govern, argue, and lead, but not necessarily men who could invent or discover. Throughout this entire process, the pressure to conform was immense. A Roman boy was not educated to find his true self or to follow his passion. He was educated to fit a mold. The goal was to produce a replica of his father and his ancestors. Originality was viewed with suspicion. The highest compliment one could pay a young man was that he was worthy of his ancestors. The education system was a conservative machine designed to replicate the social structure of the empire, generation after generation. As the young man returned from Greece, typically in his early 20s, the phase of formal education concluded. He was now ready to embark on the cursus honorum, the ladder of political offices. But the lessons of the ludus, the grammaticus, and the rhetor would stay with him. When he stood up to speak in the Senate, the cadence of his voice, the structure of his sentences, and the historical examples he cited were all the products of those long, dusty mornings on the school benches, while the young men of the elite were busy practicing their thunderous orations and pacing the floor of the reader's school. The trajectory for their sisters was markedly different. We must now turn our gaze to the education of the Roman girl, a subject that is often quieter in the historical record, but no less structured. For a girl born into a wealthy family, the early years of education ran parallel to her brothers. She would attend the primary ludus, or be tutored at home by the same pedagogus, learning to read, write, and calculate on the wax tablet. There are numerous frescoes from Pompeii showing women with styluses and tablets, famously holding the stylus to their lips in a gesture of contemplation. This indicates that basic literacy was not just a male privilege, it was a practical necessity for the running of a household. However, around the age of 12 or 13, the very time her brother was advancing to the complex literary studies of the grammaticus, the girl's formal education typically came to a halt. In the eyes of Roman law and society, a girl of 12 was considered ready for marriage. Her graduation was not a speech in the form, but a wedding ceremony. Therefore, her adolescent education was an accelerated course in domestic management, known as the cura domus. The centerpiece of this domestic curriculum was woolworking. It may seem strange to us that the daughter of a senator, a man who governed provinces, would be expected to spend her days spinning wool. Yet, this was the ultimate symbol of female virtue. The image of the Matrona sitting in the atrium, directing the slave girls in carding and spinning wool, was the Roman ideal of stability. Even the Emperor Augustus, at the height of his power, proudly wore homespun togas made by his wife Livia and his daughter Julia. It was a political statement. We are modern rulers, but we keep the old, simple ways. Thus, a girl's education involved hours of manual dexterity training. She learned to use the distaff and the spindle, turning raw wool into thread. She learned to weave on the large, vertical, warp-weighted looms that stood in the central halls of Roman houses. But beyond the mechanics of weaving, she was learning management. A Roman household was essentially a small business. A wealthy woman had to manage the accounts, oversee the supplies of food and oil, discipline the slaves, and ensure the estate ran smoothly while her husband was away on campaign or political business. Her math class continued, but it was applied to the ledger books of the family. There were, of course, exceptions. Some aristocratic families prized intellectual daughters. These women, known as doctae puellae, continued their studies in Greek and Latin poetry, music, and philosophy. We have letters from Pliny the Younger mourning the death of the daughter of a friend, Minicia Marcella, just before her wedding. He describes her as having the wisdom of an old woman, the gravity of a matron, but the sweetness of a girl. He notes that she loved her books and her reading. However, this level of education was sometimes viewed with suspicion. The satirist Juvenal wrote viciously about the annoying woman who talks about literature at dinner, correcting her husband's grammar, and quoting verses he has never heard of. For many Roman men, an overly educated wife was seen as a challenge to their authority. If the toga virilis was the rite of passage for boys, the wedding was the definitive threshold for girls. And it happened shockingly early. A girl could be legally married at 12, and many were. On the eve of her wedding, she would gather her childhood toys, her dolls, her balls, her rattles, and dedicate them to the household gods or to a temple, typically to Venus or Diana. This was a poignant moment of severance. She was physically surrendering her childhood. She would take off her toga praetexta and put on the tunica recta, a white woven tunic, and the flammeum, a bright, flame-colored veil. The next day, she would leave her father's house and proceed to her husband's. The torchlit procession, the songs, and the ritual of lifting the bride over the threshold marked the end of her life as a daughter and the beginning of her life as a mater familias. Her education was now considered complete. She was ready to manage her own miniature empire within the walls of her husband's home. But what of those who were not elite? The vast majority of Rome's population did not spend their days reading Homer or debating philosophy. For the sons of craftsmen, shopkeepers, and the poor, education was vocational. It was an apprenticeship, often formalized by a contract. A boy born to a potter, a blacksmith, or a baker would likely begin helping in the workshop as soon as he could walk. His classroom was the shop floor. He learned by observation and imitation. He learned the heat of the kiln, the smell of the tanning fluids, or the rhythm of the hammer. At the age of 12 or 13, if his father could not teach him a trade, he might be apprenticed to a master. Surviving contracts from Roman Egypt give us details of these arrangements. A father might sign his son over to a master weaver for 5 years. The contract would stipulate that the master must feed and clothe the boy, and in return, the boy must work from sunrise to sunset. Crucially, the master promised to teach the boy the trade as he himself knows it. If the boy ran away, the father had to return him. If the master failed to teach him, he paid a fine. This was education as a transaction. There were no grades, only the quality of the final product. Then there was the education of the enslaved population. This is a complex and often overlooked aspect of Roman society. Slavery in Rome was not based on race, and it was not a monolith of unskilled labor. An educated slave was a valuable asset. Therefore, investing in the education of a slave was a sound financial decision for a master. In large, wealthy households, there were specific training schools for slaves, known as pedagogia. These were often located within the master's palace or villa. Here, young slave boys, known as pueri delicati, or simply alumni, were taught how to serve. They learned the intricate etiquette of the banquet, how to mix wine, how to carve meat, how to stand silently for hours. They were taught to speak properly, to dress well, and often to read and write. For those with intellectual promise, the training went much further. A master might have a slave trained as a scribe, a secretary, or a librarian. These slaves learned shorthand, a complex system of rapid writing called Tironian notes. They could take dictation as fast as a man could speak. Even highly skilled professions like medicine and architecture were often practiced by slaves or freedmen. A master might send a clever slave to be apprenticed to a doctor. The slave would learn the art of medicine, and upon returning, he would serve as the family physician. Eventually, he might be freed and set up his own practice, splitting the profits with his former master. In this way, The university education for professions like medicine was actually a form of on-the-job training within the structure of slavery. One of the most grueling forms of slave education was the ludus gladiatorius, the gladiator school. This was a prison school where men were converted into fighting machines. The training was brutal and scientific. They were fed a special diet of barley and beans to build a layer of protective fat and heavy muscle. They were drilled endlessly with wooden swords against wooden posts. They were taught not just how to kill, but how to die with dignity. The lanista was the headmaster of this grim academy. Even here, there was a curriculum, a hierarchy, and a graduation, though graduation often meant death in the arena. Outside of the formal apprenticeships and slave training, there was one other major educational force in the life of a Roman male: the army. For the common citizen who did not have the wealth to become a senator, but wanted to see the world, the legion was the ultimate school. When a recruit joined the legions, usually in his late teens, he entered a world of total institutionalization. The army taught him a trade: carpentry, engineering, masonry, or smithing. Because the legion had to be self-sufficient, he learned to build roads, bridges, and aqueducts. He learned discipline and Latin. For provincials from Gaul, Spain, or Syria, the army was the primary vehicle of Romanization. A man might join the legion speaking a local dialect and worshiping local gods. 20 years later, he would retire as a Roman citizen, speaking Latin, having internalized the discipline and culture of the empire. The military camp was, in effect, the largest public school system in the ancient world. As we look at this patchwork of educational experiences, the girl at her loom, the boy at the anvil, the slave with his wax tablet, and the recruit with his shovel, we see that Roman education was highly specialized. It was not designed to create well-rounded individuals in the modern sense. It was designed to fit people into specific slots in the social machine. The concept of childhood as a protected space evaporated quickly. By the mid-teens, almost everyone in Rome was working, married, or serving. The leisurely, philosophical education of the elite male, which we discussed in the earlier parts, was a rare luxury, floating like oil on top of a vast ocean of practical, hard-won, and often forced learning. Ultimately, the goal of this entire apparatus, from the nurse's lullabies to the harsh cane of the schoolmaster, from the wax tablets to the rhetorical declamations, was the creation of a specific ideal: humanitas. This Latin term, championed by Cicero, is difficult to translate directly. It means more than just humanity. It encapsulates the quality of being a cultivated, civilized, and moral human being. It was the belief that education was not just about acquiring skills, but about refining the soul. A man with humanitas was gentle in his interactions, refined in his speech, and dutiful to his country. He was the antithesis of the barbarian. This ideal was preserved and cherished in the great libraries of Rome. As we wind down our journey, let us step into one of these sanctuaries of silence. By the 4th century AD, there were 28 public libraries in Rome. The most magnificent was the Bibliotheca Ulpia, located in the Forum of Trajan. Imagine entering this space. It was a vast hall lined with columns, the floors paved with cool, colored marble. The walls were lined with wooden presses or cupboards, known as armoria, which held the scrolls. The atmosphere here would have been one of hushed reverence, a stark contrast to the noisy ludus on the street corner. In the center of the room stood statues of Minerva and famous poets, watching over the readers. The books themselves were not bound volumes as we know them, but volumina, scrolls made of papyrus sheets glued together. To read a book, one had to unroll it with the right hand while rolling up the already read portion with the left. It was a physical engagement with the text. The scrolls were tagged with small syllabus tickets hanging from the end, identifying the work. In these quiet halls, the educated Roman sought otium. Otium is another concept that is hard for us to grasp. It translates to leisure, but it was not idleness. It was industrious leisure. It was the time a man spent away from business to dedicate himself to reading, writing, and thinking. For the Roman elite, the ultimate reward for a youth spent in rigorous schooling was an adulthood where one could enjoy otium, reading Greek philosophy in a garden, surrounded by friends, discussing the nature of the soul. However, we must also acknowledge the fragility of this system. The education we have described was deeply conservative. It looked backward, always trying to emulate the golden age of the past. It did not encourage innovation. As the empire grew older and more bureaucratic, the education became more rigid. The speeches in the rhetorical schools became more flowery and less connected to reality. The students were learning to speak like Cicero in a world that had long since changed. Yet, the legacy of this system is undeniable. When the Roman Empire in the West eventually fragmented and fell, the structure of its education survived. The curriculum of the Grammaticus and the Reader evolved into the 7 liberal arts of the medieval university, the Trivium and the Quadrivium. The very way we organize our schools today, the way we learn grammar, the way we argue in court, even the alphabet we use to write these words, all of it is an echo of those dusty Roman classrooms. As the sun begins to set over the 7 hills, the school day is long over. The ludi magister has packed away his cane. The students have returned to their homes. The wax tablets, once covered in the scratchings of the day's lessons, have been smoothed over with the flat end of the stylus. The wax is blank again, ready for tomorrow. This act of tabula rasa, the blank slate, is perhaps the most fitting metaphor for the end of the day. The noise of the cantare, the chanting of syllables, fades into the evening breeze. The pedagogus rests his weary feet. The anxiety of the exam, the fear of the whip, and the ambition of the forum are suspended in the amber light of dusk. The city of marble and brick, of scholars and soldiers, prepares for sleep. The discipline of the Roman mind was vast, but even the Romans knew the value of rest. They knew that the mind, like a bow, would break if it were always kept taut. It must be unstrung to recover its strength. So, let us take a lesson from them. Let us unstring the bow. Let us smooth out the wax of our own minds, erasing the worries and the lists of the day. The history is written, the lesson is learned, and now there is only the quiet. But before we truly extinguish the final lamp and leave the marble halls of the library, let us linger for a moment longer in this quiet. There is a specific magic in the stillness of a room filled with books, a magic that the Romans understood deeply. We have spoken of the students and the teachers, the noise of the recitation and the crack of the cane. But we have not yet spoken of the silent actors in this story, the materials themselves. The history of Roman education is not just a history of ideas. It is a history of reeds, soot, animal skins, and the labor of hands that transformed nature into memory. Let us drift away from Rome for a moment, crossing the Mediterranean to the fertile banks of the Nile in Egypt. It is here, in the marshes of the Delta, that the foundation of Roman literature begins. We are looking at the Cyperus papyrus, a tall, aquatic sedge with a triangular stem that sways in the hot breeze. For the Roman world, this plant was as essential as grain. Without it, the empire could not communicate, laws could not be codified, and the poems of Virgil would have vanished into the air. The creation of a scroll was a slow, rhythmic process, hypnotic in its repetition. Imagine the harvesters wading into the shallow water, cutting the long stalks. The outer green rind was stripped away, revealing the white, fibrous pith inside. This pith was sliced into long, thin strips. These strips were not pulped, as we do with paper today, but laid out side by side on a hard, wet table, slightly overlapping. Then, a second layer of strips was laid on top at a right angle to the first. This lattice of plant matter was then pressed and hammered. The natural sticky sap of the plant acted as a glue, binding the layers together into a single sheet. These sheets were dried under the blazing Egyptian sun, then polished with ivory or a smooth shell until they gleamed. The result was a material that was flexible, durable, and ready to receive the thoughts of an empire. These sheets were then glued together to form a long roll, a volumen, sometimes extending for 10 meters or more. The smell of fresh papyrus was faintly sweet, grassy, and dusty, the scent of the river brought into the study. But a blank scroll is silent. To make it speak, one needed atramentum, ink. The ink of the ancient world was not a chemical dye, but a suspension of particles. The most common black ink was made from soot. In the workshops of Rome, slaves would scrape the fine carbon residue from the ovens of baths, or from specially designed furnaces where resinous wood was burned. This soot was mixed with gum arabic, the hardened sap of the acacia tree, and water. The mixing process was tedious. It required grinding and stirring until the liquid was perfectly smooth, thick enough to cling to the pen but fluid enough to flow. For a more luxurious ink, one might use the secretion of the cuttlefish, sepia, which gave a rich, brown-black tone. There was also red ink, made from cinnabar or red lead, used for the headings of laws or the titles of books, which is why we still use the term rubric today, from the Latin ruber, meaning red. The tool that married the ink to the papyrus was the calamus, the reed pen. Like the papyrus itself, it came from the riverbank. A scribe would select a reed of the right thickness, dry it, and then cure it in hot ashes to harden it. With a small, sharp knife, the scalprum, he would cut the nib. This was an art in itself. A nib cut too broad would blot. A nib cut too sharp would tear the fibers of the papyrus. The sound of a well-cut calamus moving across a high-quality scroll is a specific, scratching whisper. Scritch, scritch, scritch. A sound that filled the scriptoriums of the ancient world like the chirping of dry crickets. In the great libraries, or in the private studies of the wealthy, the copying of books was a never-ending task. Since there was no printing press, every copy of the Aeneid, every history by Livy, every philosophical treatise had to be written out by hand, letter by letter. This was the work of the library, highly skilled enslaved scribes. Imagine a room, cool and dimly lit to protect the eyes and the ink. Rows of scribes sit at sloping desks. A reader stands at the front, dictating the text aloud. The scribes write in unison. The physical discipline required was immense. A scribe could not let his mind wander. He could not smudge the page. He had to maintain a consistent hand for hours on end. In the margins of surviving manuscripts, we sometimes find the complaints of these anonymous workers. My hand hurts, or the lamp is dim, or thank God, it is finished. They were the human photocopiers of antiquity, their muscles and eyes consumed to preserve the knowledge of the past, However, papyrus had a rival. As the centuries passed, a new material began to gain prominence: parchment, or membrana. Legend says that the Library of Pergamon, a Greek city in Asia Minor, rivaled the Great Library of Alexandria. The Egyptian kings, jealous of Pergamon's collection, embargoed the export of papyrus. Forced to innovate, the people of Pergamon perfected the processing of animal skins, sheep, goat, or calf. Parchment was heavier than papyrus, but it was smoother and more durable. The process of making it was visceral. The skin had to be soaked in lime water to remove the hair, then stretched tightly on a wooden frame. It was scraped with a crescent-shaped knife, over and over, until it was incredibly thin and taut. As it dried, the tension aligned the fibers of the skin, creating a surface that was creamy and pale. The tactile experience of reading parchment was different. It was soft to the touch, almost like flesh. It had a hair side, which was slightly rougher, and a flesh side, which was perfectly smooth. Unlike papyrus, which could snap if bent too sharply, parchment was supple. It allowed for the transition from the scroll to the codex, the book with bound pages, the ancestor of the modern book we hold today. The codex was a revolution. It allowed a reader to flip back and forth, to find a passage quickly, rather than unrolling meters of papyrus. It was compact, portable, and sturdy. It was the format that would eventually carry classical learning through the dark centuries that were to come. But let us return to the room where our imaginary Roman scholar sits. It is night. The noise of the city has truly died away. He sits in his cubiculum, a small private room often located off the central atrium or peristyle garden. The room is sparsely furnished. There is a daybed for reclining while reading, a small table, and a bronze lampstand. The light comes from a lucerna, an oil lamp made of terracotta or bronze. The wick, made of flax or papyrus, floats in olive oil. The flame is small, casting a warm, golden pool of light that barely reaches the corners of the room. The smell of burning olive oil is distinct, heavy, organic, and comforting. Every hour or so, the scholar must use a small pick to pull up the wick or trim the carbon buildup to keep the flame bright. This ritual of tending the light breaks the concentration, a moment of pause in the act of reading. He reaches for a scroll from the capsa, a cylindrical leather bucket that holds a set of volumes. He pulls out the wooden rod, the umbilicus, around which the papyrus is wound. Attached to the end is a small tag, the silibon, made of parchment or ivory, bearing the title of the work. He unrolls the beginning with his right hand, revealing the first columns of text. Reading in the ancient world was a physical performance. The text was written in scriptio continua, continuous script. There were no spaces between the words, no punctuation marks, no lowercase letters. It was just a solid block of capital letters, Arma virum quecano Troi, Cyprimus Aboris. To read this, the eye and the mind had to work together to separate the words, to find the rhythm. This is why almost all reading was done aloud, or at least in a murmur. The reader had to sound out the text to understand it. The silent reader, like St. Ambrose, whom Augustine marveled at later in history, was a rarity. Thus, a Roman library was not a place of absolute silence, but of a low, buzzing hum, like a hive of bees, as each reader muttered the words of long-dead poets to themselves. The scholar reads a letter from a friend. Letter writing was the heartbeat of the Roman social network. A letter, or epistula, was a gift of time. Since there was no public post for civilians, letters had to be carried by private messengers or friends traveling in the right direction. A letter might take weeks to arrive. Receiving one was an event. The letter might be written on a wax tablet if it was short and informal. The sender would have smoothed the wax, pressed the letters in with a stylus, closed the 2 wooden leaves, and tied them with string. To ensure privacy, he would have dripped hot wax over the knot and pressed his signet ring into it. This seal was his identity. To open the letter, the recipient would break the seal, a small, satisfying crack, cut the string, and open the wood to smell the beeswax and see the fresh marks of his friend's hand. If the letter was long, it would be on papyrus. The handwriting would reveal much about the sender. Was it the hurried scrawl of a busy politician, the shaky hand of an elderly relative, or the precise, elegant script of a professional scribe dictated to? The Romans valued the aesthetic of the page. Cicero often commented on the handwriting of his correspondence, praising clarity or mocking illegibility. As the night deepens, the scholar's eyes grow heavy. The intense concentration required to decipher the continuous script takes its toll. He rolls the scroll back up, ensuring it is tight and even. He places it back in its leather case, protecting it from the 2 great enemies of books, moisture and insects. The Romans were acutely aware of the fragility of their knowledge. They wrote of the bookworm, the tinea, the larvae that would tunnel through a scroll, eating history. Cedar oil was often rubbed on the parchment to repel them, adding another layer of scent to the library, sharp and woodsy. The connection between the Roman and his books was intimate. In a world where life was often brutal and short, books offered a kind of immortality. To read was to converse with the ancestors. To write was to speak to the unborn. In this quiet room, by the flickering light of the olive oil lamp, the scholar is not alone. He is in the company of the mayores, the great ones. Now the oil in the lamp is low. The flame sputters, casting dancing shadows on the frescoed walls. The shadows look like ghosts, or perhaps like the figures from the myths he has been reading. It is time to rest. The scholar extinguishes the lamp. The darkness is sudden and absolute. The smell of the extinguished wick, a thin trail of smoke, hangs in the air for a moment before dissipating. The sounds of the house settle. The timber beams creak as they cool. The distant bark of a dog is the only reminder of the world outside. The wax tablets are closed. The scrolls are shelved. The ink is dry. The reed pen lies on the desk, waiting for the morning. The work of the mind is done. As you lie there, imagine the peace of that room. The heavy wooden shutters are closed against the street. The stone floor keeps the air cool. There is a sense of order, of a world where everything has its place. The history we have explored, the games of the tavern, the discipline of the school, the scratching of the pen, it all fades into the velvet dark of the past. History is a river that flows into the ocean of sleep. You have drifted down that river tonight. You have seen the sights, heard the sounds, and now you have reached the calm, open water. There is nothing left to learn tonight. There is nothing left to memorize. The tablet of your mind is smooth. Rest now. Let the ancient silence wrap around you like a warm cloak. The scribes have put down their pens. The city is asleep. And so are you. Good night.